I stood on the edge of my property, staring at the white wooden stakes that had mysteriously appeared overnight, cutting nearly 10 feet into what had been my backyard for the past 7 years. My neighbor Ted waved from his porch, coffee mug in hand, and walked over to join me. "What's with the stakes, Brian?" he asked, squinting against the morning sun. "That's what I'd like to know," I replied, pulling the official-looking notice from my pocket. "According to this letter from our HOA president, everything beyond these stakes is community property, and I've been encroaching on it since I moved in." Ted nearly spat out his coffee. "That's ridiculous. Your fence has been there since before I bought my place." I nodded grimly. "Karen Michelson strikes again." Karen Michelson, Whispering Pines HOA president for the past 3 years, had been making life miserable for homeowners since the day she was elected. What had started as overzealous enforcement of trivial rules, grass height measured with rulers, trash cans visible for more than 6 hours after collection, had evolved into something that felt increasingly personal and predatory. "You're not giving up that land, are you?" Ted asked. I folded the notice carefully and slipped it back into my pocket. "Not without a fight." What I didn't tell Ted was that I couldn't afford to lose this battle. After 15 years in the Army and 2 tours in Afghanistan, this modest 3-bedroom ranch with its generous backyard was my sanctuary. My disability check covered the mortgage, but just barely. The woodworking shop I'd built in the disputed area wasn't just my hobby, it was becoming my livelihood as I transitioned to civilian life. I hadn't planned on spending my Monday morning researching property lines and legal precedents, but by noon I was surrounded by paperwork at my kitchen table. My original closing documents clearly showed the property line extending well beyond where Karen's stakes now stood. But according to the HOA notice, the community had discovered that the developer had incorrectly conveyed this strip of land to individual homeowners when it should have remained common area. The doorbell rang, interrupting my research. Through the peephole, I saw Karen herself, clipboard in hand, her blonde bob as immaculately styled as always. I briefly considered not answering, but this confrontation was inevitable. "Good morning, Mr. Daniels," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I assume you received our notice about the property line adjustment?" "It's not an adjustment if it's my land, Karen," I replied, keeping my voice level despite the anger bubbling beneath the surface. Her smile tightened. "Actually, it was never your land. The HOA board has reviewed the original development plans, and that strip was always designated as a utility easement and community green space." She pointed to a rolled-up document under her arm. "It's all quite clear in the original plans." "Then why has it been fenced as part of my property for over 15 years? An oversight that we're correcting," she said dismissively. "We'll need that woodworking shed removed by the end of the month." "The noise complaints alone, noise complaints? From whom?" "I'm surrounded by empty fields on that side." Karen consulted her clipboard. "That's confidential HOA business. I'm simply here to inform you that the board will begin landscaping the reclaimed area next month. We're planning a lovely butterfly garden that all residents can enjoy." A butterfly garden. On the land where my livelihood stood. "I'll need to review this with my attorney," I said, starting to close the door. Karen's hand shot out, holding it open. "Brian, please don't make this difficult. Fighting the board will only result in fines and legal fees you can't afford." Her voice lowered. "I understand your financial situation isn't particularly robust." The implication that she'd been investigating my finances sent a chill down my spine. I forced myself to remain calm. "Thank you for your concern, but I'll be keeping my property. Have a nice day, Karen." I closed the door firmly, my heart racing. Through the window, I watched her march back to her immaculate white SUV, phone already pressed to her ear. The next day, I took a personal day from my part-time job at the hardware store and drove to the county records office. The clerk, an older woman named Dorothy who'd worked there for decades, was sympathetic to my situation. "These HOAs think they're little governments," she muttered as she helped me navigate the system. "Let's find out what's really going on with your property." Hours later, I left with copies of every relevant document: the original subdivision plat, my deed, and the HOA covenants filed when the neighborhood was established 20 years ago. Nothing in any of them supported Karen's claim. When I returned home, a work crew was measuring the disputed area. A tall, thin man in pressed khakis supervised, occasionally pointing toward my workshop. "Excuse me," I called out, approaching the group. "What's going on here?" The man extended his hand. "Thomas Reed, Reed Landscaping. We're just taking some preliminary measurements for the butterfly garden." "There won't be a garden here," I said firmly. "This is private property." Thomas looked uncomfortable. "Sir, we were contracted by the Whispering Pines HOA. I'm just doing my job." I showed him my deed. "And I'm just protecting what's legally mine. I'd appreciate it if you'd leave until this matter is resolved." The crew packed up without argument, but as they drove away, I noticed Karen watching from across the street, arms crossed and lips pressed into a thin line. She made a show of taking pictures with her phone, of me, my workshop, my property. That evening, I called the only lawyer I knew, my buddy Blake from high school who practiced real estate law 2 counties over. "Sounds like a classic case of HOA overreach," he said after I explained the situation. "But something doesn't add up. Why would they suddenly claim this land now, after all these years?" "Maybe Karen just enjoys making people miserable," I suggested. Blake laughed. "Possible, but HOAs are usually more strategic than that. They target violations that can generate revenue through fines or increase property values. Taking your land for a butterfly garden doesn't fit the pattern." He agreed to look over my documents, but warned me that fighting an HOA could be expensive and drawn out. "They have the collective resources of the entire community behind them," he cautioned. "And they know most homeowners will give up rather than engage in a lengthy legal battle." "I'm not most homeowners," I replied. 2 days later, I received another notice, this one informing me that my workshop was in violation of HOA architectural guidelines and needed to be removed immediately, regardless of the property line dispute. The fines would begin at $100 per day, increasing to $250 after the first week. I was in the middle of a phone consultation with Blake about this new development when someone pounded on my front door. Through the window, I could see a county sheriff's deputy standing on my porch. "I'll call you back," I told Blake, my mouth suddenly dry. The deputy, a young woman with a serious expression, handed me an official document. "This is a cease and desist order regarding construction on the community property at the rear of your lot," she explained. "You're to halt all activity in that area pending resolution of the dispute." "I haven't been doing any construction," I said, confused. "And it's not community property." She shrugged apologetically. "I'm just delivering the order, sir. If you have concerns, you should address them through proper legal channels." After she left, I read the order carefully. It referenced ongoing construction activities that were disturbing protected wetland areas and violating county environmental regulations. None of this made any sense. My workshop had been complete for years, and there were no wetlands anywhere near my property. I called Blake back immediately. "They're escalating," he said gravely after I explained, "and falsifying claims to get county authorities involved. This isn't normal HOA behavior, Brian. Something else is going on here." That night, I could barely sleep. At dawn, I gave up trying and went to make coffee. Through my kitchen window, I noticed unusual activity at the vacant lot that bordered the back of my property. A surveyor was taking measurements while 2 men in business suits pointed at various areas, including the space directly behind my workshop. I threw on clothes and walked over to investigate. As I approached, one of the men nudged the other, and they quickly rolled up their plans. "Morning," I said casually. "I live right there. Anything happening with this lot?" The shorter man, balding with glasses, gave me a professional smile. "Just some preliminary site assessment. Nothing definite yet." "For what?" I pressed. "I'm afraid that's confidential at this stage," he replied, ending our conversation by turning back to the surveyor. That afternoon, I knocked on Ted's door. His wife Tanya answered, their toddler on her hip. "Brian! Come in," she said warmly. "Ted's in the garage tinkering with that old Mustang." In the garage, Ted slid out from under the classic car, wiping grease from his hands. I filled him in on the escalating situation with the HOA. "That's insane," he said, shaking his head. "But I might have some information. Tanya's sister works for the county planning department. According to her, there's a major commercial development being considered for that vacant lot behind our neighborhood." My stomach dropped. "What kind of development?" "Some kind of mixed-use thing. Retail, maybe a restaurant. Still in the early stages." Suddenly, Karen's interest in my property made perfect sense. My backyard, with its disputed strip, was the only thing separating the vacant lot from the community access road. "They need my land for an entrance to the development," I said slowly. "That's why they're claiming it's community property." Ted nodded grimly. "And guess who sits on the county planning commission? Karen's husband, Robert Michelson." The pieces were falling into place. This wasn't about butterfly gardens or noise complaints. It was about money and influence. If the development went through with an access road where my workshop stood, property values for the homes nearby would plummet, except for those on the other side of the neighborhood, like Karen's, which would benefit from proximity to new amenities without any of the drawbacks. "You need to talk to Councilwoman Tracy Valdez," Ted suggested. "She's been fighting over development in this area for years. And she can't stand the Michelsons." The next morning, I sat in Councilwoman Valdez's modest office, laying out the whole situation. With her salt and pepper hair pulled into a no-nonsense bun and reading glasses perched on her nose, she looked like exactly what she was, a former high school principal who'd entered politics to fight corruption. "This stinks to high heaven," she said when I finished. "The Michelsons have been pulling strings in this county for too long. Robert's position on the Planning Commission creates a clear conflict of interest if Karen's HOA is making land grabs related to a development he's involved with." She made some calls while I waited, speaking in the clipped, authoritative tone of someone used to cutting through bureaucracy. "Okay," she said finally, hanging up. "Here's what we know. Pinnacle Development Group filed preliminary paperwork for a commercial project on that vacant lot. They need an access point exactly where your property sits. And guess who recently joined Pinnacle's board of advisors? Robert Michelson, I guessed. Got it in one. And there's more. 3 HOA board members, including Karen, bought investment shares in Pinnacle last year." She tapped her pen against her desk. "We're not just talking about HOA overreach anymore. This is fraud, conflicts of interest, and possibly criminal conspiracy." With Councilwoman Valdez's help, I connected with a real estate attorney who specialized in HOA disputes. Tamara Velasquez listened to my story with increasing interest, occasionally making notes or asking clarifying questions. "They've made several critical mistakes," she said when I finished. "First, falsifying information on official county documents is fraud. Second, Karen and the board members who invested in Pinnacle have breached their fiduciary duty to the HOA by not disclosing their conflict of interest. And third," she smiled, "they picked the wrong person to bully." Over the next 2 weeks, we gathered evidence and built our case. Tamara filed for an emergency injunction to prevent any HOA action regarding my property until the matter was resolved in court. We also filed formal complaints with the County Ethics Commission regarding Robert Michelson's conflict of interest. Meanwhile, the pressure from Karen intensified. Daily notices of violations appeared on my door. My neighbors reported being questioned about my disruptive behavior. Someone even called in a noise complaint when I was out of town visiting my sister. The situation came to a head on a rainy Tuesday evening. I was working late in my shop when headlights swept across the windows. Through the rain-streaked glass, I could make out Karen's white SUV parked at the edge of my property. She emerged with another board member, both carrying what looked like survey equipment. I stepped outside, umbrella in hand. "It's a bit late for a property inspection, isn't it?" Karen flinched, clearly not expecting to find me in the workshop. "We're just verifying some measurements for the county records," she replied smoothly. "Nothing that concerns you. Actually, anything happening on my property very much concerns me," I countered. "Especially when it's happening after dark, in the rain, without notice." The other board member, a nervous-looking man I recognized as Phil Jensen, shifted uncomfortably. "Karen, maybe we should come back tomorrow." "Nonsense," she snapped. "We have every right to be here. This is community property." "Not according to my deed, the county records, and the court," I reminded her. "You received the injunction paperwork yesterday. You can't take any action regarding this property until after our hearing." Karen's face hardened. "The board rejects your interpretation of the covenants. We have original documents that clearly show." "You mean the documents you claim to have but never produced?" I interrupted. "I'd love to see those." Phil cleared his throat. "Karen, we should go. If there's an injunction, there's no valid injunction," she hissed at him before turning back to me. "Mr. Daniels, your continued obstruction is only making things worse for yourself. The fines are accumulating daily. Fines you have no legal right to impose," I said calmly, pulling out my phone. "Now, would you like to leave voluntarily, or should I call the sheriff and report you for trespassing?" Phil was already heading back to the SUV, but Karen stood her ground, rain plastering her perfectly styled hair to her face. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," she said, her voice low and threatening. "This development is happening whether you like it or not. The Michelsons have built this community from nothing, and we won't let some disabled veteran with a hobby shop stand in the way of progress." I started dialing the sheriff's office, maintaining eye contact with her the entire time. Finally, she turned and stormed back to her vehicle, slipping in the mud and nearly falling before regaining her composure. As they drove away, I noticed something on the ground where they had been standing, a folder, partially covered in mud and rapidly soaking in the rain. I retrieved it quickly and brought it inside. The contents made my heart race. Inside were modified survey documents showing altered property lines not just for my lot, but for 6 others bordering the vacant land. Even more damning was an email chain between Karen, Robert, and executives at Pinnacle Development discussing how to secure the necessary access points for the development and manage resistant homeowners. One email from Karen specifically mentioned me. "Daniels will be the hardest to remove. Suggests focusing on financial pressure through fines and possible disability status review to force compliance." They had been planning to report me to the VA, suggesting I wasn't as disabled as claimed, potentially threatening my benefits, my livelihood. The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. I called Tamara immediately, my hands shaking as I described what I'd found. "This is exactly what we needed," she said, her voice tight with controlled excitement. "Don't touch anything else in that folder. I'm sending a courier to collect it immediately. This evidence of conspiracy changes everything." The next morning, I was awakened by pounding on my door. 2 sheriff's deputies stood on my porch, looking grim. "Brian Daniels?" one asked. "We need to speak with you regarding a complaint filed by Karen Michelson. She's alleging you stole confidential HOA documents from her vehicle last night." My stomach dropped. "That's not what happened at all, officers." I explained the previous night's events, showing them where I found the folder and describing its contents. "The documents are with my attorney now," I concluded. "They contain evidence of fraud and conspiracy involving the HOA board." The deputies exchanged glances. "Mrs. Michelson's version is quite different," one said diplomatically. "She claims you confronted her aggressively and took documents from her hands before threatening her." "That's absolutely false," I replied, keeping my voice calm despite my racing heart. "And I can prove it." What Karen didn't know was that after months of mysterious activities around my property, I'd installed security cameras covering my workshop and backyard. I invited the deputies inside and showed them the footage from the previous night, which clearly showed Karen and Phil entering my property uninvited, Karen dropping the folder, and me retrieving it after they left. The older deputy nodded slowly. This contradicts Mrs. Michelson's statement in several key aspects. Would you be willing to provide us with a copy of this footage? Absolutely, I agreed. And I'd like to file a counter-complaint for trespassing and filing a false police report. By that afternoon, the situation had exploded. The sheriff's department, now in possession of both the security footage and copies of the incriminating documents, had opened a formal investigation into Karen and the HOA board. Councilwoman Valdez called an emergency session of the County Ethics Commission to review Robert Michelson's conduct. And Tamara filed an expanded lawsuit against the HOA, Pinnacle Development, and the Michelsons personally. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. Neighbors I barely knew stopped by to offer support or share their own stories of Karen's intimidation tactics. Several revealed they had also been pressured to sell portions of their property or face mounting fines and harassment. 3 days later, the local newspaper ran a front-page story. HOA scandal, property scheme exposed in Whispering Pines. The article detailed how Karen, Robert, and 3 other HOA board members had allegedly conspired with Pinnacle Development to force homeowners to give up land needed for a commercial development, land that would make their investment shares in Pinnacle substantially more valuable. The morning the story broke, Ted texted me a photo of moving trucks outside the Michelson home. Running away? I texted back. Looks like it, he replied. Cops showed up an hour later. Missed them. But the Michelsons hadn't escaped. By evening, local TV news was reporting that Karen and Robert had been arrested at the county line, charged with multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, and misuse of public office. The other implicated board members were cooperating with authorities in exchange for leniency. 2 weeks later, I sat in the courtroom as the judge ruled on our emergency motion regarding the property dispute. Karen and Robert, released on bail but looking significantly less polished than usual, sat with their attorney across the aisle. Based on the evidence presented, the judge announced, including the original deeds, county records, and subdivision plats, I find that the disputed property is legally owned by Mr. Daniels and was never community property as claimed by the HOA. Furthermore, he continued, peering sternly over his glasses at the Michelsons, I find the actions of the HOA board in this matter to be egregious and potentially criminal. He ordered the HOA to remove all claims against my property, cancel all outstanding fines, and pay my legal fees. He also referred the matter to the district attorney for possible additional charges. As we left the courthouse, Tamara squeezed my shoulder. This is just the beginning. The class action lawsuit from all the affected homeowners will likely end with the dissolution of this HOA entirely. Good riddance, I said, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders for the first time in months. Back home, I stood in my workshop, running my hand along the workbench I'd built when I first moved in. The tools hanging neatly on the wall represented not just my hobby but my future. Custom furniture orders had been steadily increasing, enough that I was considering leaving my part-time job to focus on woodworking full-time. A knock at the open door interrupted my thoughts. Ted stood there, holding 2 beers. Figured you might want to celebrate, he said, offering me one. We sat on the back steps, looking out at the property that was now indisputably mine. Heard they found evidence the Michelsons have been pulling this same scheme in other developments, Ted commented. Apparently, they've made millions flipping investment properties after manipulating zoning and access points. Not anymore, I replied, taking a satisfying sip of beer. Ted raised his bottle in a toast. Here's to standing your ground. And to good neighbors, I added, clinking my bottle against his. In the months that followed, our neighborhood changed dramatically, for the better. The HOA was indeed dissolved after the class action settlement. A new homeowners association eventually formed, with transparency and limited powers written into its charter. Ted was elected president, with a commitment to focusing on community events rather than restrictive regulations. As for the vacant lot, Pinnacle Development withdrew their plans after the scandal. Instead, the community pooled resources to purchase it, turning it into a genuine nature preserve with walking trails and, ironically, A butterfly garden that everyone could enjoy. Karen and Robert Michelson ultimately pled guilty to reduced charges in exchange for testimony against higher-ups at Pinnacle, who had apparently been running similar schemes throughout the county. They avoided jail time but received hefty fines, community service, and 5 years probation. They also lost their home in Whispering Pines to help satisfy the civil judgments against them. 1 year to the day after finding those mysterious stakes in my yard, I completed a custom dining table for Councilwoman Valdez, my largest commission yet. As I carefully applied the final coat of finish, I reflected on how differently things might have turned out if I had simply accepted Karen's claim and surrendered my land. Sometimes, standing your ground isn't just about protecting what's yours, it's about exposing the truth and preventing others from becoming victims. As I ran my hand over the smooth oak surface of the completed table, I felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with woodworking and everything to do with justice. The workshop that Karen had tried so hard to demolish was now the heart of my thriving business, a business that would never have existed if I had given in to her demands and intimidation. Sometimes, fighting back isn't just an option, it's an obligation. And sometimes, the property lines that matter most aren't the ones drawn on maps, but the ones we draw for ourselves when we decide what we're willing to stand up for.